Okay, so 805, I think you're probably all aware, this may be, in fact, the reason some of you are here today. 11B-805 has been pretty significantly overhauled by OSHPD. By way of quick review, the ADA version of 805 is like a paragraph long. The OSHPD version is probably more like 15, 20 paragraphs long. And there's some real zingers in there, so we're going to go through that in a fair amount of detail. These are the subheadings. There's general, patient bedrooms, waiting rooms, exam diagnostic, and so on. We'll go through each of these 7 sections, one at a time. The first section, I don't know that we need to beat to death. It's just general. Effectively, we've already covered that back in the scoping section. They refer specifically to 805, so that's how we get there. It does apply, in our opinions, to medical office buildings. So here we go. For the sake of saying it, neither the ADA or the CDC define a medical care facility, but again, we've kind of already bought into the fact that this applies to medical office buildings. Okay, so then the section 2 applies only to patient bedrooms. So if you're not working in a hospital or skilled nursing facility, this section will never apply to you. This is only patient bedrooms. Now there's 3 sections to this. There's not too much new from the last code, but we'll go through these one at a time. So the hand washing fixtures shall comply with 606, which is essentially saying they shall be accessible. Kaylin's going to go through this topic, this hand washing fixture thing in more detail a little bit later, so I'm going to blow by that. The beds shall have a 36-inch aisle on both sides along the full length. Now what I've done here, I've added in buff color there the previous code language. OSHPD has changed the code language just a little bit. The previous code said you need the 36-inch aisle along each side of the bed. Now they've changed it to say along the full length, which causes a problem. In my world, and I'd be curious to get your take on this, this is almost reverse discrimination. That if you're in there, for lack of a better way to put it, the regular patient bedroom, you can have a nightstand right there, and you can put your cards and flower vases and stuff right by your bedside. If you're in the accessible room, OSHPD's requiring along the full length of the bed a space, so we can't put a nightstand there. It has to be 3 feet away. It's not a good thing in some respects. Steve.
So there's no reach range for that?
Yeah, yes, you're going to reach 3 feet. Yeah. Okay.
Put a shelf on the wall and have 27 inches of clear space below it.
Well, yeah, it's kind of into a different. You have to have 3 feet of space.
Well, if you have 3 feet, but if the shelf was mounted at 27, let's say top was 28, bottom was at 27. It
Yeah.
could protrude.
It
So
may
now
affect
it's
the
got-
along the full length.
Yeah.
And the other, I'm sorry, the other thing that you run into, and I'm not trying to
No, please.
steal what's coming, is those computer stations that end up there at the head end wall in a lot of settings.
Let's see. If you're talking about a shelf over here,
No,
that wall,
adjacent, yeah.
yeah,
I guess
Full
based
length.
on the diagram.
the requirement is a 36-inch aisle on both sides of the full length. Now, this gets into the same interpretation thing. I blew by a slide there, but for reference, so back in the architect hospital design world, in the 1224 sections of the building code, they require a 3-foot aisle between the beds and any wall or obstruction for all your rooms, not just the accessible rooms. So in an OSHPD world, this really isn't that big of a leap. They're already requiring a 3-foot aisle on both sides of all of the beds. So in their world, they're saying, well, what's the big deal? We're just putting it in the accessible part of the code. It's parallel to the other part of the code. The problem we run into is this is not just fixed walls and obstructions. This would be furniture and equipment. So it does cause us some issues. Yeah, Chris.
Back on the your second slide there, you know, it says along the full length of each side. It doesn't say both sides. So typically, wouldn't you say that there's 4 sides to that bed?
Wow.
If we're gonna look at, you know,
In the word, no.
nitpicky, yeah. Only if it's not attached to the wall.
Who invited me? He's our vice president. Okay, I don't want to beat that one to death. This isn't that much different than the previous code.
I'm gonna make a comment to that. The chapter 12 does have some requirements about the clearance for at the foot end of the bed. And of course, there's always accessible route requirements. And I think there's something in the CAM that also talks about excluding those requirements at the head end of the bed because they.
Well, and that's one of my points is if they call it a foot in your end in other chapter, why don't they say that in this chapter and be, to me, that's almost like they're saying each side, which would include a foot in it.
Because a human wrote it.
Yeah.
That's the funny thing. Let me take that in 1 second. When you start getting into the code writing world, you write what you think is clear.
Yeah.
And then wow, what do you mean each side? Does that mean 4 sides? Really? But yeah, when you get into writing code, you find there are so many things that you thought were clear that really aren't.
Yeah.
Steve?
Does that clear aisle have a height limit?
Well, it doesn't say that. And that does bring in question what this gentleman was saying. What if you have stuff?
Something that's 27 inches
Yeah.
above.
I think in practical terms, it's treated the way we would treat an accessible route.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that, but that's the way I think most people approach it. Could you agree? Or does that take us somewhere else?
This is terrible to admit. I'm not a plan reviewer. I've never done a plan review. Most of the projects I've worked on have been on very removal projects, and so I remember a couple of months ago, I asked Jim Terry and Dan Woosley, some of y'all know him, and Dan does a majority of our plan reviews, and I said, so can a plan reviewer not use common sense? And that's
It's a trick question.
I'm sure that's, I thought we all don't do it that way, but. So if I were looking at that room with a shelf instead of a table at the head end of the bed, I'd think about how the room is used, who uses it, what kind of patient care they're delivering, and do the staff need to be able to get to the head of the bed to intubate somebody, or do the life safety or measures of patient care that they need to do. So I think how I would look at it in that way would be different from how somebody would look at it on paper.
You need to
And how you make those two meet.
So in real world, actual, what does it look like? 3-foot aisle. Not rocket science. One of the things I want to point out here, one of the things that we're taking the position as a healthcare provider is that furniture that we have in the room should have a home base. So if somebody slides it on into that accessible area, it can be slid back into a home base where it's not in that aisle. And if we have that, I feel good that if somebody has an issue, they have a need, we can provide for that need. And then we don't have to get too worked up about the rest of it. Now, medical equipment, this part of it, we're taking the position, medical equipment is a necessity. They are here for medical treatment. If the doctor needs to bring in medical equipment and put it beside the bed, I'm not going to say he can't. This is what they're there for. So, however, we get into the loosey-goosey question, okay, well, you can't park medical equipment there and then leave it there, and it's a 400-pound thing. It's got to be medical equipment that can come and go within reason.
Just pull the bed away from the wall.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I was doing the inspections on our CASI jobs 3 or 4 years ago, and you go in and you measure, they go, well, it's 34 inches. So you go,
Yeah.
measure again, 36. It's furniture.
Yeah.
You know, and these beds, they come and go everywhere. They'll have the patient, they pull the patient out, take him to surgery, bring him back. The bed doesn't go in exactly the same spot. So,
But you're also not saying that that side table and the side chairs are not, shouldn't be provided in there, because really those are part of the care that they get. They've got an barometer or a glass of water, a couple of aspirin that sit on that table, Kleenex. You know, somebody that needs to get up and sit for a certain number of hours a day in order to progress in their recovery, those side chairs are necessary for. And a lot of nurses want those side chairs or need those side chairs close to the bed because maybe it's a hard transfer or they don't have, that's a whole nother
Absolutely.
issue, but you know, for whatever reason that, or tubing coming out of the head wall. They need that chair to be close so that they don't have to move those tubes into another connection. So ours probably wants to know that that space is there, that it's provided.
okay, I think that summarizes it pretty well. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next. So one of the questions we get into is, well, what about, you know, the patient's food tray on wheels? We're going to say that's okay. That can be rolled around. It is small, it is lightweight, it can be pushed out of the way as needed. We're not going to lose any sleep over having that in there. Now, the next code section in 805 is waiting rooms. This is new stuff. It's not big stuff, but it's new. So you need wheelchair spaces in a waiting room for a medical facility. And again, those of you that do medical office building work, this would apply. In your waiting room, you have to provide a space for wheelchairs. So it's a 5% requirement. So if you total up all the chairs that are red, there's 23 of them in this example. You do the math, 5% is 2. So you have to provide 2 spaces for a wheelchair. So it's a furniture thing, a little different for those of you that are building officials or do a plan review function. We're now getting into, you gotta review furniture placed on drawings. Yeah.
A question about how you identify those spaces. If it's movable chairs and
It's furniture.
do you actually put in an ISA? Or?
We don't.
Yeah.
I don't think, it doesn't say that you have to. The code does not say you have to identify or mark them. You have to provide them. And so if I walk into a waiting room and there's a space, I can measure it, I'll call it good to go. What do you think?
I'm going to take my cap off for a minute and talk to you as Kaylin. I would hate to see that in a beautiful waiting room. You're telling me I have to sit there? You know, it's not segregating, but it just has a funny feel to me. But then the other piece of that is just that doctor's office or hospital or whatever facility it is, they have to train their staff about what that space is for and why it's necessary. And why don't they have to keep it clean?
Chris?
In the 2010 code, it said that the clear wheelchair floor space adjoined or overlapped the accessible route. Now it only says that it adjoins the accessible route and no longer allows an overlap. So you really have to make sure that you had the 36 or 44-inch path of travel around that, not overlapping it anymore.
You know, I've never made that connection. That's interesting.
And the ADA doesn't put in the overlap anymore. And it's been really huge in bathrooms, because if you have, you know, the clear floor space at a lab, and then you have to provide the 36-inch, soon to be 44-inch path of travel to the water closet compartment,
So-
not allow them to overlap.
I think they're allowed to overlap.
Not under the 2013, they left that language out.
But that
But that
doesn't mean
doesn't
it's
mean it-
excluded.
Right. It doesn't say can't overlap.
Mhm.
Then you wouldn't be allowed to overlap, but it says it must join.
Well, the join doesn't mean overlap.
For example, in a waiting room like this, if wheelchair at the top who's parked there, nobody can get by it if it raises to the
Yeah.
second aisle. And I think
Right.
that's important.
I wouldn't allow that, for example, I'm a building inspector, so in a restaurant, because the person sitting there would constantly be having to move because it's an overlap position if somebody wanted to get by. So it seems to me that it should be an independent space.
See, doesn't this 805.3 send you back to the assembly area,
It sends you to 802.1.
which I think,
I think that's a clause for assembly.
It's the wheelchair space section.
which I think says it has to be outside of the.
Now I have homework. I have.
So it's just something to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm gonna move on.
And then the other
We'll have to
thing,
follow up on that.
the
Yeah.
other thing is the alcove space needs to be the 36 by 48, but this other side here is not an alcove situation, so it can be 30 by 48.
Now, one interesting thing about this code section, when you follow that 802,
Yeah.
that defines the wheelchair space as 36 inches by 48.
46.
It's a unique and different application. So it's generally, again, this is furniture, so it's not typically a huge issue. I want to get to this one because this is really our big topic. 805.4, examination, diagnostic, and treatment rooms. So this is the code language on the screen. We're going to kind of take this apart and analyze it a little bit at a time. Of course, the big thing here is you need a 36-inch aisle on the full length of each side of beds, exam tables, procedure tables, gurneys, and lounge chairs. Got some examples we're going to go through and look at what about this, what about this, what about this. There's an exception for general exam rooms in a non-emergency setting. We're going to take each of those topics separately and go through that also. So by the time we get to the end of it, we should have like 6,000 questions. First part of this, for the sake of saying it, the language is all-inclusive. It doesn't give you a qualifier, so it's understood it's 100%. All exam rooms, all diagnostic rooms, all treatment rooms. If you've got 16 radiology rooms, all 16 radiology rooms must comply with these requirements. The exception is in two separate bites. You have to qualify on both counts to get the exception. It has to be, number one, a general exam room, and number two, in a non-emergency setting. So the quick version of this graphically, it's funny, I had to do this. I created this on SketchUp because you can't, in an exam room, get far enough back to take a picture that shows the room. So anyway, you need a 3-foot aisle on both sides with full length. The rub that we run into in the healthcare design world, you tend to put the exam table nestled into the corner so that staff can move around both sides. It's an efficient way to use the room. This causes us major headaches because when you do the math, it's like 9 feet across for the full length that needs to be cleared. It's a huge impact on our facilities. So I'm going to go through a number of examples here of different actual applications. A CT scanner room. We have clearly a 3-foot aisle on this side and on this side. A X-ray room, we have 3 feet on this side and 3 feet on this side. MRI room, 3 feet on this side and 3 feet on this side. And I guess the point being, these rooms are pretty roomy. We're not finding that we have issues with the diagnostic rooms or the treatment rooms. They tend to be already designed with plenty of space to spare. Our issues are when we get to smaller rooms. We've got an ultrasound room. We're barely making it here. We've got our 3-foot aisle, but it's in the doorway. It's not a code problem here, but just to demonstrate, this is getting kind of smallish. The 3-foot aisle in this case, here's where we have the medical equipment in that aisle. Now we're saying this is okay, that this is on wheels. For that matter, this is on wheels. We could pull that forward a foot if we needed to. But it's, the cheese is beginning to bind, as they say. And then we get an infusion room, where you've got dialysis or infusion function. You're getting to where you've got chairs rather than exam tables. The language refers to lounge chairs, but this is what they meant. You've got a lounge chair, it's like a Barco lounger, and the patient will sit in here for several hours while they're undergoing infusion treatment. So our 3-foot aisles on either side. Now, I didn't stage the photograph here. This is the way it actually is when I went out there. Now, we've got medical equipment and a trash can. You can see that easily you can push the trash can back and get the medical equipment out of the way. Question,
How
Tom?
do they transfer, how would a person using a wheelchair for mobility?
Oh, it's like we staged this. This is perfect. Yeah, well, and that's one of the questions we have. It's like, well, how the heck does that work? So I was geared up. I went down to Oshkosh and talked to them. Like, do you realize how unreasonable this stuff is? Well, then I go and I Google images, infusion chairs. These are the ones that I bought 5 to 10 years ago. When you buy a new infusion chair, almost every last one has a arm that is removable that allows people to get in from the side. So I got to admit, this is not as crazy as it may appear at first. These particular chairs, the old school version, you have no choice but to get into them from the front. But the newer ones are actually designed typically so you can get in them from the side. Okay, just a couple more photographs of how that works. Again, we're saying this is really not an issue. It's in the aisle, but you can push it back. It's on wheels. Yeah. Yeah, this is most definitely a non-emergency setting. Yeah. However, this is not a general exam room. We're going to get to that in just a minute. Another topic, as you see what's actually out there in the field. So we've got what we were talking about earlier. What about objects on the wall that confine your 36-inch aisle? So as we've been talking, it's effectively treated as an accessible route. So there's a height below which I would say, if this was down here, it really does interfere with the 36-inch aisle. But when it's up higher, I would say it's not. Oshpod's take on this was that up to 4 inches, they would be okay with it. Their documents doesn't actually say that. Their guidance documents don't actually say that either. But that was our guidance. Now, in the floor plan view, the exam rooms are the ones we're having trouble with. So I guess my bigger point, what we've been finding, diagnostics and treatment tend to be bigger rooms, not a problem. Exam rooms are where we really are having our problems. So in an exam room, you've got the 36-inch aisle on one side only, which we get the exception for that. That works pretty well. So let's explore that a little bit, the general exam room. What does that mean, the general exam room? So I went to Oshkosh and asked them, what do you guys mean, general exam room? And I got that, it's not specialized, it's general, okay? It's simply not specialized. So the code does have a definition of an exam room. Now, it's not a definition of a general exam room, but it does provide us a window into what an exam room is. And I think the way I like to describe this, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, acts like a duck, probably a duck. An exam room has a better structure, an exam table. It's in which procedures that do not require a specialized suite can be performed. So when I go to see my doctor, I go in the room, you have a chair, you sit down, you wait for the doctor to show up, there's an exam table there, there's typically a sink. That's an exam room, a general exam room. Chris?
The dentist's office, the dental chair, is that specific or is that general?
Yep.
So that would be both sides?
Yep.
With the spacing on both sides, would that be applying both to the patient and to employees? Are employees considered in that?
Yeah, let me come back to that, but yeah. So in a general exam room, as we've been going through trying to get a handle on what does this mean, we've categorized on this side of the slide general exam rooms. Basically, it's an exam room. If on the drawings that you plan to review, it says exam room, probably a general exam room. We've got what is called an exam plus, which means a bigger exam room, basically. And the issue kind of goes away because our room is bigger. But those of you that do plan checking work can appreciate the architect may call it something on the drawings, and that may change the way you classify it. So you may see names for rooms that you're going to be left wondering, well, what is that? Is that specialized or is it general? So we've gone through quite a category of different room types and tried to start classifying them. At a glance, these all appear to be specialized. Now, I mean, just like in the last 24 hours, we're taking another look at this. Our company is saying, well, wait a minute. You know, some of these, say the injection station is a good example. An injection station, they don't have an exam table. They don't have a lounge chair. They've got what amounts to a old school classroom desk where you sit down and there's a little counter there that you put your arm on and you get an injection. So if somebody comes in a wheelchair, they're not going to make them offload from the wheelchair and into this chair to check their blood. They're going to just say, well, just roll up here, and they do the procedure in the wheelchair. Now, it's a loosey-goosey thing, because then what we're wanting to do is say, okay, then we're not going to do a 3-foot aisle on both sides of an injection station chair. We're going to instead provide a wheelchair space for that. But then we're going to have to push back to OSHPD or the local building departments and pitch our argument to them, because it's just not, it doesn't really fit into the category of a general exam room. It's really not one of those. But we're taking the position it's not really a sort of thing that needs an aisle on both sides either. Then we go through some of these other categories that are very similar. The head and neck exam room. Yes, Kaiser.
We actually had discussions specifically about the injection station with OSHPD.
Okay.
Yeah.
Listen.
And the way they explained it is the reasoning why you have to have a 3-foot aisle at the side of the chair, even though it's not a lounge chair, is that there are others besides those in wheelchair who will need assistance to get into the space. But they would look at it as a general exam room, not requiring space on both sides.
Well, very good. It's informative. I appreciate that. Yeah, so we're pushing back. Kaiser's pushing back. We're going to get everybody to start pushing back. Because this stuff, I get the sense OSHPD didn't really go through all of the analysis of these things and say, what about this one? What about this one? If they don't fit in the category by title of a general exam room, but they also, like the stress testing room, you tend to have a treadmill, and then there's a separate table, then you work on the treadmill, then they take you off and they lay you on the table, and then they check your vitals. So there's, and I think we'll look at one of those, an actual example later, but they don't all fit in one nice, neat box. The big picture, these are all unique, and we're going to pitch some of our best arguments and push back a little. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to move on. The other half of this is the non-emergency settings. So, what does that mean? The non-emergency settings, it's the other duh, it's not in an emergency room. Or in an emergency-like area. When I went and talked to OSHPD about this, they effectively left themselves wiggle room, that not just an emergency room, but in other things that are emergency-like, but you press them for examples of that, and then it's like, well, if it's like an emergency room. Okay. So the good news here is you're very, very rarely going to have a general exam room in a non-emergency setting ever. for the most part, when you go into an emergency room setting, they will be doing procedures there. So it's not just an exam anymore. It tends to already fit the category. You're going to have the 3-foot aisle on both sides anyways. So that's that. So again, you'd have to qualify under both. It would have to be a general exam room in a non-emergency setting. Almost all of our general exam rooms are in a non-emergency setting. Basically, none of them ever are. All right, the other part of this code section, I think Kaylin talked about this earlier, the equipment. Oshkosh has added this. It's really kind of a throwaway code section. It says you have to have what amounts to mounting space to get on and off of medical equipment. That's really nothing new. You're already going to have it anyway because you're going to have a 3-foot aisle on one or both sides. And you have to have turning space, which is nothing new. So that's that. Before I move on, I'm kind of motivated to move along here. Any other questions on this code section, this part of it?
Was there a question about the access aisle in the patient's room? So the patient's area, it says the wheelchair space shall join accessible route. And then it does say,
yeah,
shall not overlap, the accessible route shall not overlap the wheelchair spaces, so.
In the waiting room or the patient waiting room?
That's in 802.
Yeah.
What section is that?
Oh, 802.
So maybe to be clear on this, what you're saying is the code section there is saying that you cannot overlap the wheelchair space with the accessible route. They can't overlap each other.
802 shall not overlap.
802.1.5 says wheelchair spaces shall not overlap circulation paths.
Okay, so there you go.
The assembly area seating space uses that same section.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. Good point.
Bars, restaurants.
Yeah. Okay, I want to move on. The patient change area. This is again another new subsection under this 805 heading. Good news here, an observation. This is essentially a scoping section in disguise. There are not new technical code requirements here. This is a patient care area, and then they point us backwards to the scoping section. So what they're doing is saying, okay, go back and look at the scoping section, and 5% of each type of these things must meet the accessibility requirements. And I think what Oshkosh is doing, the reason they're doing this is to make it clear that the requirements for these things for patient care areas, whether it's in a dressing room or whether it's not in a dressing room, these requirements still apply. So it's fairly common that you will have lockers or coat hooks and shelves in a radiology area that's not in the dressing room. It's where they simply hang up a coat or where they access lockers while they go in to get an MRI. So fortunately, there's really not much new. It's scoping. This subsection for hand washing fixtures, this is where Oshkosh says clearly all hand washing fixtures, lavatories, and sinks shall comply with 606. Kaylin's going to pick that one up in more detail a little bit later, so I'm going to move on to the last section here under this 805. So this one kind of weirded me out the first time I read it. It read like, holy smokes, this is huge. The more I read it, the more I find there's really not that much there. It doesn't change much in our world. So I'm going to walk this through carefully. I'm color coding it. We'll look at the red areas, then the green, and then the purple. There are a couple of exceptions, which I think are self-explanatory. If you've got a wardrobe in a non-accessible room, it does not need to be made accessible. It's in the non-accessible room. And then the clinic lab, they're noting the scoping requirement for clinic labs is 5%. So I want to go back now and look at this thing kind of in the color coding. The red is the what. What are we talking about? The subject of this code section. The green are examples and the purple are specific requirements. So the what that we're talking about here are built-in cabinets and work surfaces and counters. That's the topic of this code section. So graphically, cabinets, countertops, and work surfaces. That's all this code section is getting into. Because they include in the explanation a number of room types, it leaves the impression, oh my God, they're including all kinds of stuff. Well, they're really not. It's just dealing with these three things. Now, they give examples, patient wardrobes, nursing stations, administrative centers, reception desks, medicine prep areas, and so forth. They're simply examples of where those things occur. So one of the byproducts of this is in their explanation of the stuff that's in green. It's not, I went down and asked Oshpot about this. It's not an all-inclusive list. Essentially, you write et cetera, et cetera, et cetera to the green section. Pretty much the entire facility, whatever the room type is, whether it's a clean or soiled utility cabinet, a laboratory room, whatever type of room is in your facility, they're saying these requirements will apply. Then the actual requirements, again, kind of good news, this is essentially scoping. There are no new technical requirements. So they've referred to two code sections, 225 and 902, which is storage and dining and work surfaces. So if we take those one at a time, we look at 225. Again, this is backwards scoping. You're in a technical code section, and it says, go back to scoping, which is a little odd, but it is what it is. So we've got our scoping section for storage, and we get inside of that. It says at least one of each type shall be accessible, and lockers, 5%, no less than one, and then self-service shelving simply needs to be on an accessible route. And that is it. So the storage section 225 is all we really get into is the storage issue. Now that gets a little weird. In an actual example, here's storage in one of our rooms. We have upper cabinets and lower cabinets, and that's the rub that we get into here. Code says at least one of each type shall be accessible. Well, one of the things kind of skipped over in writing this, what Oshpot has done is said 225 scoping section will be applying to the staff side of things. This is not the public side. If you go through this scoping section, you might not come to the conclusion that that applies on the employee side. Well, since 805 is the staffing stuff, and Oshpot has made clear up here that it applies at nurses' stations, administrative centers, and so on, what you're really doing is saying this scoping section will apply to the employee side of the fence. Now, we get into the storage thing in each type. We've talked about this internally. What is that really? How do we apply that when you've got upper cabinets? Those just are not accessible, and they never will be. So, does that constitute a different type of storage? No. Our agreement of all of our tasks are no, as long as we don't have one of those weird things where this is specifically keeping certain kinds of things that you can't keep down to. If that's not what's going on, as long as we have a lower cabinet and an upper of the same type, we will accept it as meeting that requirement. So we really don't end up with any change occurring here. Now the other half of this is 902. Again, there's no scoping. In discussions with Oshpot, they've said, well, go ahead and apply 226. And this is a huge point. It's not in the document, but it's a huge point. When you go to 226, that says your 5% minimum of 1. Now, since this is dealing with dining and work surfaces, and for our purposes, it's really just the work surfaces. As you go back and look at scoping, it gives you that 5% minimum of 1, and then the technical requirements are your 34-inch maximum height and your knee and toe space. So I'm going through all this kind of at high speed. Where I want to get to is to the actual application of this, where you have a work surface for staff. Okay, our folks kind of freaked out when we first read through this, because we were thinking, holy smokes, are they saying every single work surface in the hospital needs to be a 34-inch maximum? Because if that's what they're saying, we're not going to go with that. You're going to end up with staff who, by their very function, are walking and standing, and a 34-inch height countertop is completely inappropriate. It would be causing back issues. We're not going to go there. We're not going to do that. So, in discussions with Oshkosh, again, they said, no, just apply the scoping section 226, 5% minimum of 1. So, really, in each and every place in the hospital, in each and every room type that you're dealing with, you need to have at least one of these work surfaces that meets the accessibility requirements for work surfaces. Tom?
Yeah, does that mean, and I want to go back to what you just said, for each room?
Yeah, I said room type, and I didn't mean to say type. For each room. Yeah, so if you've got 3 or 4 different nurses' stations, each of those nurses' stations shall have at least one station that meets the work surface requirements. And so on and so on. And where we get the rub for us is you get some that are fairly small areas. A utility room has a little counter and work surface. So if that's defined as a work surface, it'll have to have knee space, whereas a lot of those that have been built prior have base cabinets there. That's going to be the more real impact to us.
Yeah, well, the real rub that I run into is the nurses' small workstations where they're expected to write stuff or add stuff into a computer terminal, which are, they're just up in the air at 40, 50 inches, something like that. Does that mean that I need one of a similar type at 34?
What kind of is it an off-the-wall hung thing?
Yeah, two things. One is the wall hung unit, which can be slid down, and that's generally adjustable. Okay, by the way, they're about $1,000 right there. It's not cheap. The other one is the little platforms where nurses often stand if they're mobility capable to write stuff on a chart or something like that. And in those situations, do we also then need one at 34?
So you're at that point where we need to have the conversation with Oshkosh / argument with Oshkosh about when you have an area that staff does some work function, but it's designed for them to be standing and walking.
That's correct.
Are they going to insist that we have And we haven't had that conversation with them yet. I'm not sure how that's going to go. But I know we're going to run into it eventually where we've got, not every countertop would qualify as a work surface. Sometimes it's just a counter that happens to be the top of a base cabinet. They put tongue depressor jars on it. It's not really a work surface, but somebody could interpret it to be a work surface and require knee space.
Okay,
and that's going to be the conversation, the battleground there. Let me get, Steve's got a question.
In the picture you've got there, how are you handling the reach range of the work surface to the pass-through?
Great question. We're not.
To the what?
To the pass-through.
Pass-through. Okay, well.
Low counter.
Sorry, I thought you were going somewhere else.
In other words, the person who's seated, who's trying to reach for something is left on the pass-through counter. The reach ranges don't work.
The pass-through counter.
The one where the on the left standing.
The guy standing,
right up here.
leaves something on the counter.
Okay, so the short answer is this code section doesn't address that. This code section refers to work surfaces, cabinets, built-in cabinets, counters, and work surfaces. It's really not addressing the reach range issue. So you go elsewhere in the code.
Part of the work surface and work effort is to pick up stuff
Look
on
here.
the counter. Yes. But can't reach.
Yeah, so the question will be, what qualifies as a work surface? If you've got an upper counter like that, are we going to call that a work surface?
It's a leaning
But
surface.
if you're kind of going in Title I, reasonable accommodation issues there too, and if that's a need, then you can address that without having to.
Yeah, but you might finesse that by saying, I have minimum of one work surface that meets the 5% requirement for scoping. That particular workstation is right here. You have a workstation that meets the requirement in that
Just make it less than
workstation.
25 inches deep.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify the way you presented this.
Yeah.
So the base code section says 11B902, which talks about the work surface requirements for front access. And Oshpod is telling you that they interpret that, or their intent was to apply this scoping section
Yes.
226, but it doesn't say that in the code.
That's right. So you could have a,
somebody could sue you for it and say the code says, and Oshpod does the interpretation in there. Well, that's great, but for the
yeah,
issue
we've got, and to add to the issue, we've got all of the cities and counties that are dealing with this too, in addition to Oshpod. And in Oshpod, you've got maybe 20 different architectural plan checkers who may or may not have gotten the message that the scoping section applies. So we may get some serious
So at some
issues.
point,
that
maybe if
bubble
we're
up.
lucky, they'll pin or can it, but otherwise.
Yeah. Let me get to Tom, there's, and then
Yeah,
Michelle.
so you're interpreting, Rashford is interpreting the second gate there, and shall comply with 11B225 as a limiting statement
I'm not sure I understand what you said.
or a qualifying statement. I'm looking at, 8057, and 8057 is telling me that built-in cabinets and work surfaces shall be accessible. And then the second part of that is, and shall comply with 225. So is Oshpod and you or whoever, are they saying that 225 is limiting that to the scoping only to the 5% requirement?
I'm still not sure I get.
That's our I'll talk to
Yeah,
later.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Let me kind of wrap this. Oh, I'm sorry, Michelle, you had something.
Pharmacy fill station.
Pharmacy fill stations. So they, go ahead.
They're typically standing
Right.
work areas. They can be common use. They are typically built-in cabinets and work surfaces. But clearly, because they're standing, they do not comply.
So I'd be curious, okay, I mean, and this is really good conversation, we're gonna have to work out these details. Part of me says 5% minimum of one. Because what would you actually do if you had a pharmacist who was in a wheelchair? If it's designed, if they're all designed up high,
But you have one station.
One low station.
or you've got a pharmacist who's 6'8".
It stands up.
Would you allow repositionable?
If I were king of the world, I would say 5% minimum of one. I would require one station in the pharmacy.
To be
If
permanently
it's
at that.
relocatable, I'm not sure I would go with that myself. But, I'm a former Oshpod.
We specifically talked about that as well.
So what does Oshpod say?
And so they said 1 or 5% of each type. So you have your fill stations, you'd have to have one. And then you have your other types of stations in the pharmacy, and then you have one. So you have multiple types of stations in a pharmacy. It's not just 1 or 5% of the total workstations in the pharmacy.
It's nice when we ask Oshpod and then we get the same answer. Okay, I need to move on. We've got a lot of ground to cover. I think we're on to Kaylin.
Okay, special issues, fast and easy. We wanted to talk about some things that we, Evan Terry, we have seen pretty commonly, and that we, as cohorts with Sutter, have seen, and came up with this list. One of the other things covered in the scoping chapter in chapter 2 is protected entrance. For a covered passenger loading zone at one of the entrances, the interesting, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. The CAN talks about this a little bit. They actually just clarify the requirement for that covered passenger loading zone. So they say that only one entrance is required to meet this requirement at the facility. That entrance is not required to be the primary entrance to the facility. So if you've got a large hospital in Modesto and it's got 3 different entry points where people come in and out generally during the day, only one of those would have to have a protected entrance. And only the passenger loading zone has to be protected, so it doesn't include that vehicle pull-up space that's attached, or that's, you can't say it's a part of the passenger loading zone because then that statement doesn't work. But the vehicle pull-up space that's right next to the access aisle for the passenger loading zone, that vehicle space doesn't have to be protected. So the requirement for the covered entrance is in CDC. ADA dropped the covered portion of it. So outside of California, you only have to have a passenger loading zone. It doesn't have to be covered. Is that good practice? No. Yeah, you know, think about your grandmother and she's not well and she's running a fever or whatever. You don't want your grandmother to get wet anyway. You know, you just want to protect people from the weather, and especially when they're not well. I have no idea why the ADA dropped that, but I know it was a controversial topic when they were putting that out for comments.
Your grandmother must have been mean.
They must not have been. They didn't have our grandmother, did they? They did. So, some of the things that we see.
No, you're fine.
Some of the issues that we've seen with passenger loading zones, detectable warnings. I don't think that they'll ever go away in California. I think we're all stuck with them here, unfortunately. They do good things for a lot of people with visual impairments, people that are blind, but then they do cause some issues for other people. I'm going to talk personally for a second. I don't like them. If I'm having a day where I'm having a lot of leg pain, they absolutely rattle my teeth. And if you've been out in public with me, you've seen me go out in the street or out into the drive lane to avoid detectable warnings, especially if they're big or not done right. The hotel this morning has, I noticed they had 3 or 4 brand new, beautiful curb ramps, and the route from the curb ramps around the hotel to the entrance, it was all just really well done. Those detected, and maybe it was because they were new, those detectable warnings were really big, and they just rattle your teeth. They'll also flip me toes over nose in a heartbeat. And when that happens, it's going up or down a curb ramp for me. When that happens next to moving traffic during rush hour in Washington, D.C., I tend to not be very happy the rest of the day. And that's true story. The block that the access board's on, I was going to a committee meeting one morning, I had my computer bag on my lap, I'd not slept well the night before because of, it's just so intense when you go to those things. Ran across the street on my light, right when I was supposed to get to that curb ramp, and I was laying like a turtle on my back with moving traffic 6 feet away. So that's another reason I don't like them. But then you walk-in people. Everybody's distracted. We've got cell phones. We're talking to somebody else in conversation. We're trying to wrangle a couple of kids. We're not paying attention. Somebody walking with crutchers or walker or crutches. Babies in strollers. I don't know how babies spiel about detectable warnings. If you find one in the car, you let me know, you ask them and you let me know, because we are really concerned about this. But I will say with elderly people, you know, the average ambulatory person, when they swing their leg through, when you swing your leg through when you're walking, that's called the swing phase. And you clear only between an 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch when you're walking. And those, that's not much difference between those two. We had one facility that we were looking at, we had 2 surveyors outside looking at the loading zone and some parking out there, and they were out there for maybe a couple of hours, and within that time frame, they saw two elderly people fall on the detectable warnings and taken away in an ambulance. This was at a hospital. So it's not, unfortunately,
How do we fix it though?
you
Do they call it
show
alarm?
up at the code meetings and express your concern either way if you have.
What I proposed in my jurisdiction was that 247 requires the truncated domes to be approved by DSA. DSA's IR says that in lieu of their approval, because they're not an approving agency, they'll want the manufacturer's 5-year approval. So I proposed to my building official that we're not going to accept DSA's IR. We want truncated domes with DSA approval stamp, and if it doesn't have them, we'll not allow them to be installed.
It is a huge issue with advocates. DSA has been going round and round. They would love to have input and comments on this issue, but it's hard to get because this is a big deal for big businesses, small ones too, but really big businesses because it costs them a lot of money with trip and fall lawsuits, so they don't want to go into a public forum and say, we have this
Or at
issue.
least better scoping information on how to install these properly. Because we see so many weird situations, and we're all trying to do the right thing, but we just don't know any better.
Yeah, you come to a parking lot and it's all yellow because, yeah, proper application would be a good step.
So is a parking lot hazardous to the way?
Well, that's part of that.
That's another discussion for another day.
Yeah, it's a goal forever.
For DSA, yes, it is. DSA considers it a parking facility.
Yeah, it depends who you talk to.
And the DSA doesn't want to make a commitment because I've been writing for years and really telling him, the DSA, what I see in the field, that it really needs a definition of hazardous, it needs examples of applications. They don't want to go there because they cannot cover with examples everything that goes on. But it is a really.
I think it's a discussion, they won't settle it for the next code because they've been trying to settle it for a long time.
Well, and specifically what they say that in the definition of vehicular way, parking facility is a vehicular way, so therefore they say that you need the detectable warnings.
Yeah, they're taking the harder, pretty much anything, the more conservative approach, anything that's adjacent to a vehicular way, that's what DSA is requiring now. So you gotta go with the most conservative approach if you wanna be safe at this point, the way the code is. Yeah.
Until somebody sues you. Because
Yeah, and then you have the other issues.
Yeah. So another tiny piece of this, and I don't know how y'all have solved this, is an ambulance loading zone. And I think what brought this question up was, do they need to have detectable warnings, especially this one up on the top right.
Can I jump in on this one?
Yes, please.
So we've decided as Sutter, we're not going to put them in at ambulance entries. As long as there is a separate public entry, it's cruel. If somebody's been in a car wreck, they take them out of the ambulance, put them on a stretcher, and then roll them over one of those things. So we're not going to do it.
Oh, I like that answer. So bedpan flushers, the code application notice talks about these a good bit. Really just clarifying it. Chapter 12 requires that a clinical sink in the soil utility room of the nursing unit, and then they give an allowance for that clinical sink if there's somewhere else to clean those bedpans. This example is a facility that we saw just recently where they they hit it right on the money, where this photo example is something that would not be acceptable. The code application notice clarifies all this by saying that the bedpan flushing devices in the patient toilet rooms are an allowance and not a requirement. And that it has to be a unit that will not affect that rear grab bar. So you can't split the rear grab bar, and you've got to have gripping surface for that full 36-inch length.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the second sentence. You're saying you cannot split. You cannot split the grab bar.
Yeah, so they want to see this and not this. Because this doesn't allow that
It should
full
say not.
36 inches. Yes, that was one of the mistakes. Insert not. I noticed that yesterday. That's one of the mistakes here. My mistake. In 604.5.2, the exception here does not apply to bedpan flush mechanisms in hospitals, according to the CAN. So here's another setup that we see a good bit in patient rooms where they split that rear grab bar so that they can put that tall flush in. And it was an older facility, and specimen pass-through cabinets, we see these a good bit in all shapes and sizes. The things to think about are clear floor space, reach range, and grab bar clearance, to have the required clearance above and below a grab bar. And we've had some talk in the office recently about the door and the spring on the door and the control on the door, and we're not quite there yet, but we've been talking with somebody at the access board, and you know, is that a two-handed operation? And probably not really. So to see these little spinners is a good relief. It takes care of all that. But we do see them quite frequently where they're right above the grab bar, or they're stuck over in a corner where you don't have any clear floor space at all.
Do they need to be 12 inches above the grab bar?
Yes.
Yeah.
They have to be 12 inches above if they protrude.
If they protrude, correct. If it's flush mounted, then that shouldn't be an issue. So signage in hospitals, especially in patient rooms, at the toilet room, this is a little bit of an interpretation and maybe kind of finagling it the way that we want to. The gender signage, that requirement refers you back to 603, I think it is. That says that that gender geometric sign is required at all accessible toilet rooms. Well, the final express terms that they just released that are effective next July point out that they made an error there, and that geometric symbols apply to all toilet rooms, not just accessible ones. Well, is it really needed in a patient room on that toilet room door? We feel like it's not needed. DSA has seen some funny things in that code section, so they are making an effort to clean that up. ADA has an exception for patient door maneuvering clearance at patient room doors that says you don't have to have that latch side clearance. California does not include that exception, so the latch side clearance does have to be provided in accessible patient rooms or patient rooms with mobility features in California. Telephones, I don't know who, does anyone else still have payphones? Y'all still have payphones?
In some areas.
In some areas. There is a requirement for TTY in certain locations. We had a large hospital in Boston. We were surveying all that main corridor in the lobby on the ground floor and all of the elevator lobbies and towers. I think it was 17 or 18 floors. And we decided to do all the telephones one day, just to kind of get those out of the way. And it was really, really big. You go from one building to another through 5 buildings, so it's a lot of telephones. 2 days later, surveying something else, and there's a guy pushing a cart with all those payphones. So he'd take them all out. So, I can see where emergency rooms could be a good place to have them. We just don't see them very much at all. We talked a little bit about computers and being protruded, or computers in exam rooms. I started this job 11 going on 12 years ago, and that was really at the infancy of electronic medical records. So we weren't seeing this very much then. And now you just don't go into an exam room without seeing some kind of computer station. And it's a lot to think about, and it's hard to figure out where to put that so that it's an accessible room, so that the caregiver can do their job in the most efficient way and in the best way, and actually have eye-to-eye contact with the patient, heaven forbid. But they can cause issues. The one in the top left, right in the doorway, that causes maneuvering clearance issues. We know that they don't get folded up and put away, so that they're likely protruding objects, whether they're in an exam room or in a corridor or a patient room. And if they have a policy to fold them up when they're not in use, that's great. But do they really fold up so that they're not a protruding object? So a lot of things to think about with those. Sorry, I'm going kind of fast. The 2010 standards and California 13 have added some requirements for exercise equipment.
That one. The 30 there on the left between the two machines should be really 36 because it's in an alcove. And I clarify that with the access board because they do have this graphic. It's their graphic.
Yeah, it's their graphic.
Yeah.
And that's a great point.
They told me yes, you absolutely, but
great.
It is 36, right? Because it's
because it refers back to the
clear floor space. You
section.
have another approach the other way, and you need a 60 approach when it's more than 15 inches deep.
Yeah.
That will apply also.
Great. Thank you for that.
So you're saying, I'm sorry, so you're saying if you can access the clear space from both sides, it only needs to be 30, is that what you just said?
No, what I'm saying is that the space needs to be increased to 36 because
It's
you
more than
are
24.
confined in an alcove by 2 pieces of equipment.
Mm-hmm.
The same if you have a parallel approach and you're confined by equipment and more than 15 inches deep, you will have to increase that 48 to the 60.
So Gilda, why are they not saying 44 because it's a two-way aisle?
Because they're not California and they don't recognize California requirements.
But if you ask them enough, they realize their oops, and then, because I did a presentation just on the equipment of health class for the record, so I had to really research everything, and that's why I talked to the guy about this.
Very good, thank you for that. I have to remember that. So this applies to all different kinds of exercise equipment: treadmills, stair steppers, electricals, bicycles, hamstring curl machines, you name it, because they want one of each type. And they also, not only do they want an accessible route to each type, they want a 30 by 48 or 36 by 48 clear floor space. That clear floor space between two different machines, or clear floor spaces can overlap, and 2 different machines can share a clear floor space. But you've got to think about what that machine is and how it's used. If it's, if you've got 2 different hamstring curl machines and one is sitting in it and you pull the machine down, where you transfer to that one as opposed to a chest press bench that's right next to it, kind of want to be centered on that. So you just got to think about the equipment and how it's used. Treadmill, some wheelchair users are actually going to get up and use that treadmill, or somebody's going to park their walker next to it. The main thing here is that they're trying to provide that space so somebody can get to that equipment.
You know, in that, Kayla, in that picture that you just had there on that walker on the upper right, having the clear space next to it versus at the end doesn't seem like it would make, you know, requiring that to be beside that one where that has the rail extending the full length of that, doesn't seem like that would make much sense in the real world application.
I would just look at the equipment. Is it just the rails that are different? Does it provide the same service? You know,
One way that it might make a difference is if you have a place to park your chair, and then you stand up and you enter that.
step up onto it and you've got support there.
So you need someplace to set your chair.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you get 10 different people with disabilities and they're going to take probably 10 different things that would be easiest for them. Handrails, it's something new to the 2010 standards and the 2013 CBC. They're not required on walking surfaces, but if they're provided and the slope is less than 5%, then they need to be compliant. They did write in an exception for the crash rails and bumper guards that we see in hospitals so much, because the gripping surface is integral to that support that's down here, like bottom left. And there's a requirement that only, I think, 20% of that gripping surface could be obstructed, and they're giving you an exception for that so that you don't have to go in and take all those bumper guards out. So here's the big kahuna. Lavatory sinks and washing fixtures. Everybody's favorite. That's why everybody's here today. So if you look at the sinks section in the scoping chapter, side by side, ADA and CBC, ADA has an exception for mop and service sinks. California adds in scullery sinks, and then they add an additional exception for scrub sinks. So the CAN has an interpretation for this. The scoping section refers you to 606. Then there's also something in 805 about hand washing fixtures, lavatories, and sinks, requiring all hand washing fixtures, lavatories, and sinks to be accessible. The CAN, OSHPD's interpretation is that this applies to all lavatory sinks and hand washing fixtures for public and patient use. So therefore, that makes it a common use fixture, and so they all have to be accessible. And of course, they still have that exception for scrub sinks and for workstations where the sink is the workstation. And an example of that would be an endoscopy sink where they clean the endoscopy equipment, but not necessarily the hand washing fixture in the endoscopy room where all the caregivers have to wash their hands before and after they do the procedure. So all hand washing fixtures, you know, that opens up just a huge amount of plumbing there. If you think about exam rooms, treatment rooms, corridors, conference rooms, waiting rooms. This photo example is in a waiting room where they've got a coffee station and you can go and fill your cup up and get a tea bag. And they've got this great solution where they have it fixed so that you can open the doors, and that's an accessible sink. So all of the accessibility requirements in 606 applies, and 606 is sinks and lavatories. Lavatories are subject to the exception under knee clearance that reduces the knee clearance at the front edge to 27. And we'll look at that a little more in detail in just a minute. Hand washing fixtures are special application sinks, and they don't. That same exception does not apply to hand washing fixtures. I'm going to skim over that one right now. So clear floor space for a forward approach. The exception in transient lodging, accessible units, sleeping rooms, and suites. Parallel approaches is permitted in those areas at wet bars and at a kitchen sink in a space where a cooktop or conventional range is not provided. We skimmed over that a little bit before, and Bill had said, be hard pressed in some situations like an exam room or a treatment room where you could actually apply that exception. So these slides are just the code text, so you have an easy reference for it if you want to refer back to it. So the lavatory need clearance and sink need clearance are different, or they have different requirements. The lavatory need clearance, you can see in the figure up on the right, you have to have 29 inches clear at the front edge, 27 inches clear at 8 inches, at least 8 inches back from the front edge. And that space between 9 inches at the toe space and 29 inches at the front is considered need clearance at an accessible lavatory. So then sink need clearance is different because they don't use that 29 inches at the front. They're just looking for 27 inches clear at the front and 27 inches AFF at 8 inches back from the front edge. So, and it makes it even more confusing or helpful if they've got this right next to the lavatory requirement. So then lavatory toe clearance is also different from sink toe clearance, where the lavatory need clearance should be no deeper than 19 inches. So 19 inches maximum. Where with the sink, and here's another one of my typos, the sink toe clearance depth is 19 inches minimum, not 17. 17 is the ADA number. So what do you do when trying to figure out how to jump into this, and those fixtures that are 18 inches by 18, pretty much, where you wash your hands, and y'all probably put a lot of those.
Yeah, so Oshkosh has reclassified hand washing fixtures to be considered as sinks now. For a long time, Oshkosh considered them to be lavatories. What makes a difference here, because the depth is not allowed, or I'm sorry, it has to be a 19-inch minimum. So you put an 18-inch deep fixture and you're not compliant all of a sudden. So I mean, our take on it is from now on, all of the new fixtures that we install under the new code will have to be at least 19 inches deep.
Simply, and I believe your discussion with Oshkosh, you asked them if their people knew about it, and they had gone through some kind of training process to let their people know to be on the lookout for that.
That's a lot. I'm sorry, it just escaped me. You're supposed to watch it.
Welcome to California.
Kayla, you know, it says it has to meet 606, which has an exception that allows a parallel approach is permitted to wet bars. And the definition of a wet bar is specifically just says an area or space with a counter equipped with a sink and running water, but without cooking facilities. So why would that sink that's at a counter without cooking facilities? It doesn't say in a kitchen or in a residence.
Look at the definition of a wet bar.
It's
where you, it's I just.
No, the definition.
Be hard pressed to call that a wet bar.
DSA's definition of a wet bar specifically says it's an area of space with a counter equipped with a sink and running water, but without cooking facilities. Doesn't say anything about in a residence or anything like that. So those pictures of those sinks without a cooking facility could technically, by the definition, DSA's own definition of a wet bar, be considered a wet bar and therefore allow a parallel approach.
That's what they're not sinks. They're lavatory. They're hand washing fixtures.
So you
But it
have
says
to
it
go-
has to meet 606, and
Go back to the
laboratories and
definition of
sinks.
a sink or a lavatory. They are defined differently,
Yeah, laboratory is for washing hands, sink is for washing anything else.
and they have depth requirements.
The same 6.5 inches.
But yeah, it says it needs to meet 606, which allows you to use the parallel approach.
Right, but the exception is only for a sink, not for a lavatory.
No, the exception is also for wet bars.
Which has a
Which is a
sink,
sink.
not a lavatory.
I'm still saying that though the wet bar, by definition, could be a sink with running water and no cooking facilities.
That's what I'm saying, that by definition, a wet bar must have a sink. A wet bar cannot have a lavatory.
No, right, I'm saying not in those situations where there's a lab. I agree, not in a bathroom where it's a lab, but where it's a sink, not a
In
lab.
an exam room, the whole purpose of that plumbing fixture is to walk toward the doctor or nurse to wash their hands.
And like he's just
So
saying,
therefore,
it's,
it is a lavatory.
Well, they're
It's a
just-
hand washing, it's a hand washing fixture.
well, then they're just
It is
saying
not
that
a
it's,
sink.
I think I just heard him say that Oshkosh is saying it's not a lab, it's a sink. So it allows that
Yeah, let me
27
pick up
inch.
that
The
one there.
hand washing fixture.
So we've been placed, I represent the hospital, and all of our hospitals. And we're in a bit of a bind because I'm looking at it that way. Not just because Oshkosh used to, but we look at it and go, this is called a hand washing fixture. It specifically has a gooseneck spout and is designed that you are not allowed to have a staff touch it. It has to be hands-free. It's designed specifically to wash your hands. I went and talked to Oshkosh about this, and they said, oh, we're going to start calling them sinks now. Why is that? I had this conversation. Why? Well, we noticed that when patients come in with their families, they fill up their water bottles with the fixture in the room. And so now it's not for staff just washing their hands, it's also performing these other functions. So we're going to start calling them sinks. I feel that puts us in a bit of a legal bind. If we go along with Oshkosh and do it their way, we would be open to legal challenge, regardless of what Oshkosh says, because somebody else would say, yeah, but that's for washing your hands. Shouldn't it meet the laboratory requirements? So we're taking the position, we better be careful. We're going to comply with both. We're going to design all of ours from now on to comply with both the standards for sinks and labs. Now that's the call we're making. I suppose others may choose to do differently. But there is a weirdity about this. Is it a sink? Is it a lab? Just to tack on one of those things, we're not comfortable going with the calling it a wet bar thing. I wouldn't. That's just me.
I wouldn't either. Yeah.
Karen,
Yes.
let's check in with Gary. We're closing out at 12:30 and we could go for another hour, but we're not going to go for another hour.
Where it is, this is an interesting topic and I don't want to just end it. But at the same token, if we want to take lunch, so we can take a half hour for lunch, come back and resume to where we are, and then just kind of eliminate the, well, all we had that we were going to go over is the hardship form in that process and bring you up to date as to what happened at our strategic planning meeting, which we could get over that within an hour. So what I recommend is we take a short, brief lunch, eat our lunch, and come back and continue with the training. Is everybody comfortable with that?
Yes.
Okay, and those that, I think we only had 2 people that didn't plan on attending the general meeting that was gonna be for the training, just grab a sandwich and have lunch and come on back. Beautiful day. There's places to sit out here. Dublin has a beautiful layout here to go eat lunch, and let's come back at at 1 o'clock. How does that sound?
Lunch, where do we get lunch?
Right there. It's not the end.
I go-